Welcome to the One Human Nation Show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and I'm just uploading some clips here for today's show and make sure I've got everything in place. But for the sake of time, because there's a lot I do want to share with you on the show, I may have to play some interlude music at some point around the 5:30-ish mark to upload some of the other promos that we need to do. So in case this is the first time you've tuned in, this is a friendly reminder that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So one of the things that that this show is all about is having a safe, honest, open, and productive environment for talking about race, racism, and this show is going to focus a lot on the Black identity and what that means and why we've kind of lost it, because everything seems to start with the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And so if you were born and raised in the United States of America, attended public schools, that's pretty much what you started your history on. So let me start with just kind of the intro to the One Human Nation show, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and the same mindset. And for those that are listening and driving from work, you know, it is a shift. So let me start with that. And hold on one second. Here we go.
You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Again, welcome to the One Human Nation show. And if you're just tuning in, I'm the host, Sandy Batiste, on the One Human Nation show. So this show is going to be talking about the Black identity crisis, the untold story before the Atlantic slave trade. And so we're going to be kind of unpacking, looking at, you know, where were we as a people before this? Because we typically don't hear a lot about it. And there's a mystery because the students in school don't hear this because that's not how the history is taught to them. And what I have observed in our youth coming up is they want the truth. And if there is not a match between what they're living in their lives and what they're supposedly teaching in school, they're not connecting. And so this happens, from what I'm observing at a very young age, before they even get to third grade, because many of them are in survival mode. And they're in generational poverty. So they don't get exposed to the truth, and then they're thrown into a school dynamic that's not matching their truth. And I think in order for us to really start focusing on, helping our youth, not only do we need to know the story, we need to be able to convey the story to them in a way that they can identify and do their own research and go, okay, this is why then this didn't make sense to me, because this is not their truth in what they feel. So we're going to start by focusing on this clip that I found. It runs for about 15 minutes, and it's going to identify the 10 African tribes that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, because we hear a lot about, Africans were enslaving other Africans. And so let's start unpacking that and see, what we can learn about because Africa is a huge, it's a continent. It's not just one country. And there are many, many, many different tribes. So this particular clip attempts to identify the 10 African tribes in the Atlantic slave trade. So let's take a listen to that.
It's nearly impossible to make an accurate list of the most prominent ethnic groups taken in the Atlantic slave trade. The one thing we can measure for the most part are the general regions enslaved Africans were taken from, and even the cultural and linguistic dominance of these groups upon arrival. What up, African world? It's your boy Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And remember, if you want access to sources, courses, exclusive videos, or you simply want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. The Atlantic slave trade was the most tragic event in human history because of how it displaced millions of Africans from their homes and began a legacy of oppression for their descendants, generations to come. And this human tragedy is not even taken into account the Arab slave trade of African men and women, which is seldom discussed. Popular culture at times assumes we can't know which ethnic groups were taken in slavery, but with a little digging, we can identify, highlight, and remember the people who experienced this tragedy. One way we can honor these Africans is by speaking their names and acknowledging their history and experience. So let's begin with the top 10 African ethnic groups taken in the Atlantic slave trade. At number 10, we have the Shamba people. The Shamba are located largely in northern Nigeria and Cameroon. They're an interesting group of people because their oral history seems to suggest that Shamba identity largely formed due to a mixture of two people who spoke different but similar languages. The Daka and local speakers migrated and intermingled with each other, forming a strong Shamba identity. They were victims of incessant slave raiding by the Fulani Jihads in the 18th and 19th centuries. It seems to have gotten so bad that they migrated to the mountains, organized themselves, and retaliated, attacking slave and trading caravans. For number 9, we have the Wolof. The Wolof are located in Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. The origins of the Wolof are debated, but a general belief is that the Wolof originated further north and began a migration southward into Mauritania and Senegal. The Wolof founded their own kingdoms and even an empire, but warring led to the enslavement of many Wolof populations. A segment of Wolof society contend that their first kingdom and founding father came from the Almoravid Empire and traveled south, bringing Islam to Senegal. Most Wolofs today are Muslims, but violent jihads in the past led to the enslavement and displacement of Wolof society. This violence was so prominent that it led to internal disagreements among the Wolof on Islam. At number 8, we have the Abron people. The Abron inhabit the borderlands of Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. They are part of a larger Akan cultural and linguistic ethnic group. The Akan people themselves are believed to have migrated to the forested regions from a more northeastern region of the Sahel. The Abron have a matrilineal system of descent like all Akan-speaking groups. They were essentially in the center of the Gold Coast slaving populace, and many were caught up in it. Because such a large number were taken, they were given a specific name in Jamaica, known as Coromantes. Coming in at number 7, we have the Fulani. The Fulani are one of the largest, if not the largest, ethnic group in West Africa. They take this title because they are dispersed amongst so many nations in West Africa and are even present in Eastern Africa. They can be found from Senegal all the way to the Central African Republic. The regions that they're most concentrated in is Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon, and that's just the concentrated regions in which they are present. The origins of the Fulani are very hotly debated, but the most sound evidence points to their origin in North Africa. They are probably one of the original people in North Africa, due to some of the wall paintings that some scholars say point to their presence going all the way back to 6000 BC in Algeria. In fact, their history is very rich and full. They were well known throughout every region they inhabited and mixed with other ethnic groups. They had vast empires and kingdoms all throughout West Africa. Fulanis converted to Islam very early in their history and were the primary slave raiders in West Africa. The Fulani sold so many African ethnic groups throughout their history due to the jihads and slave raiding missions they initiated. Ironically, even though they were one of the primary slave raiders, they themselves were constantly enslaved. In fact, some of the most popular slaves taken to the New World were Fulani, like Ayuba Diallo, Omar Ibn Said, and Abdul Rahman, all of which were taken to America specifically. Because they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest ethnic group in West Africa, it only makes sense that they got caught up in all the Atlantic slave trade mess. In fact, I myself am a product of this, as my maternal ancestry, according to DNA analysis, is Fulani. For number 6, we have the Mande. Now, some of you may think it isn't fair to pick the Mande because the Mande are a collection of ethnic groups all over West Africa that speak the Mande languages. But it's nearly impossible to pick one Mande speaking group out of all of them because there's so many, and they're dispersed throughout so many countries in West Africa. The most dominant Mande group probably has to go to the Malinke, also known as a Mandinka. I guess we'll focus on them because the Mandinka built the greatest and one of the largest empires in West Africa. They influenced other ethnic groups culturally and linguistically, and they raided the coastline of West Africa, intermixing with coastline people. Even some Fulani themselves have Mandinka ancestry. The Mandinka were so prominent and popular that the term Mandingo, which is an English corruption of the word, became a popular reference for strong black men with many attributes. The origins of the Mande are said to be in the Sahara, further north. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Mande groups were the first producers of stone settlement civilizations in West Africa, where they built elaborate fortified structures in Mauritania. Mande culture was the most dominant in West Africa from around 1100 BC all the way to 1600. The Mandinka raided the coastline of West Africa, creating many hybrid kingdoms, all of which got caught up in the Atlantic slave trade. Coming in at number 5, we have the Fon.
So we're going to pause right there. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we are unpacking the Black identity, what I consider to be a crisis, and why we see some of the names that we see from how people are naming their children, which we're going to get into the second half of the show as far as what the impact that this has on blacks in the United States, that in many instances, there is an unconscious bias when we see a name that we immediately identify as somebody being black or African American or person of color, however you want to describe it. So we are looking and learning about the 10 African tribes that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and we're getting ready to go into number 5. So thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the One Human Nation show, and I'm your host, Sandy Batiste.
Fon people. The Fon people are the largest ethnic group in Benin, found particularly in its southern region. They are also found in southwest Nigeria and Togo. The Fon people historically were a sort of hybrid ethnic group. Oral history of the Fon people speak on the intermarrying between the Aja and the Yoruba, creating a new ethnic group called the Fon. The Fon people created a very popular kingdom in the 17th century called Dahomey, as they were well known for their female warriors, later called the Dahomey Amazons. In fact, Black Panther's Dora Milaje were inspired by the Fon female warriors. The Fon people were both victims and also victimized by other ethnic groups in the Atlantic slave trade. They became a significant populace amongst the enslaved peoples of Haiti and Trinidad. The popular Haitian voodoo is a direct descendant from the Fon people. It became the catalyst used to win the war against the French in their successful war campaign to gain their freedom. Coming in at number 4, we have the Bakongo. The Bakongo people are a Bantu people living along the Atlantic coast of Central Africa. They live primarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Angola. Similar to the Mandinka in Upper West Africa, they created one of the most prominent empires in their region of Central Africa, called the Congo Empire. The Bakongo migrated closer to the coast around the 13th century from the northeast, and became one of the first Africans below the Sahara to convert to Christianity via trade with the Portuguese. The Bakongo got wrapped up in the Atlantic slave trade, largely due to Portuguese intrusion. The Portuguese were literally taking citizens of the Congo Empire and enslaving them illegally. It got so bad that the king of Congo wrote a letter to the Portuguese king. Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers, and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust after Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them. After having taken these prisoners secretly or at night, as soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron. In fact, the grandson of the king of Congo was taken into slavery. His name was Ganga Zumba, which translates into Great Lord. His mother, the Princess of Congo, led a battalion in the Battle of Mbwila, but the Portuguese aligned with the African enemies of Congo, which included the notorious Mbangala, who were pretty much the Zulu of the region, and other African forces joined the fighting, numbering in the thousands. Due to the defeat at Mbwila, her son was taken to Brazil as a slave. But Ganga, knowing who he was, refused to be a slave. He became the first leader of a massive runaway slave settlement in Brazil. Some even referenced it as a kingdom because it had a palace, guards, and ministers. Brazil, like much of South America, became a port of entry for many Bakongo people and was one of the main entry ports for most enslaved Africans in general. Many people don't know that most enslaved Africans went to South America and not the North. Breaking our top three, we have the Igbo. The Igbo are an ethnic group native to present-day South Central and Southeastern Nigeria. The Igbo are one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa. Even though the origins of the Igbo are debated, they have a strong presence in Nigeria for thousands of years. The Igbo got caught up in the Atlantic slave trade due to the Aro Confederacy. The Aro people had migrated to the region of Igbo land as a result of the demand for slaves and palm oil. The Aro Confederacy captured and enslaved Igbos and sold them to Europeans. Many of the slaves taken from the Bight of Biafra would have been Igbo. The slaves taken from the Bight of Biafra accounted for about 13% of all the slaves taken to the Americas. Coming in at number 2, we have the Yoruba. The Yoruba are an ethnic group of southwestern and north-central Nigeria, as well as southern and central Benin. The Yoruba, like the Fulani, are actually one of the largest ethnic groups in Africa. In North America, they might even be one of the most recognizable group of Africans, the face of an African immigrant, if you will. The Yoruba were the dominant cultural force in southern Nigeria as far back as the 11th century. The origin of the Yoruba can be placed before the Oyo Empire around Ele-Ife. The Oyo Empire was active in the Atlantic slave trade as Yorubas became victims and victimizers in the process of enslavement. The Yoruba were dispersed en masse to multiple locations in North and South America, with enslaved populations going to Cuba, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Brazil, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, and many others. The Yoruba seemed to impact the culture wherever they landed. Yoruba culture became so prominent and dominant that the Yoruba pantheon began to be worshipped in North and South America. The Orishas today are still worshipped and celebrated. And coming in at number 1, we have the Mbundu. The Mbundu people are primarily centered in Angola today. There are multiple stories surrounding the origins of the Mbundu, but the most complete one seems to point to the fact that they descend from a people group that had multiple chiefdoms around the Zambezi River. According to the Atlas of the Atlantic Slave Trade, most enslaved Africans came from the region of Congo and Angola. These Africans were largely taken to Brazil, especially from Angola. The Mbundu had many kingdoms that were vassal states to the larger Congo Empire. Queen Nzinga was the most popular Mbundu queen from that region and had extensive interaction with the Portuguese. Because the demand for slaves were so high, the Congo Empire established slave raiding and perpetuated warfare with Mbundu kingdoms, enslaving many Mbundu people. The Portuguese themselves would align with the Mangala to enslave many Mbundu people. The presence of the Mbundu was so high in Brazil that they began to influence the culture itself. Most Mbundu slaves were war captives, so they developed their own martial art technique and brought it to Brazil. This Mbundu martial art was called Ngolo, and in Brazil it later became known as capoeira. Capoeira is one of Brazil's biggest cultural indicators and a symbol of strong Mbundu presence in Brazil. Evidence of the mass amounts of Mbundu people taken in the slave trade is my own paternal ancestry, according to DNA analysis, which is Mbundu. I'm glad that I can have somewhat of an idea of what happened to my Mbundu ancestor who survived his journey, making me a product of survival. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like this video and would like to see more, you can support the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below.
So we've been listening to, if you just tuned in the One Human Nation show, we've been listening to a breakdown of the top 10 African tribes that were involved in the slave trade. And so I hope you get a sense, and if you are a study of the Gullah Geechee culture here in Savannah, you may recognize that there is a direct connection to the Igbo tribe and the story that is told about them. So, you know, part of learning our history is we have to do the research. And, you know, the whole idea of a Gullah Geechee community wasn't something that just has been here all along. You know, it's fairly recent that areas have been referred to that way. And I definitely grew up in a Gullah Geechee community in the south side of Savannah. And so I'm very fortunate that my mom was a historian for a community organization there that was established in 1954. So she left a lot of information and collected a lot of information doing her research that I'm able to tap into and add to. And as I did the research, I realized that in our very own community, yes, we actually had plantations, because, you know, I was kind of offended when I started looking at these names of subdivisions and they all had plantation as part of their names. Lo and behold, there were actually plantations, and I won't get into that because there is another there's a couple of more clips that I want us to listen to get an insight into why we have such an identity crisis in the Black community in the United States, and why I think it has an impact on our youth and their inability to have an identity other than what they're told about the transatlantic slave trade and the pictures of slaves on slave ships and the whips and the, you know, on the backs. And I am going to attempt to post the actual video link to some of these clips that you're listening to, because I think when you can see the faces that he's posting and the art that he's posting, you can definitely see some of the connection, especially if you're a person of color, particularly a Black person in the United States. You may see some similarities into features of your own relatives. And I think that's fascinating. And I think the youth would be interested in actually seeing the video as opposed to just hearing, you know, me talking about it. So there's another clip that we're going to listen to, and it refers to a tribe that is referred to as the Nilites, the Nilotic peoples. And these are the very darkest and very thin people, as well as the very tall people that I think is fascinating to also include here, because we see more of that coming out where people that are descendants of this tribe that are extremely dark skinned are really embracing their heritage and not trying to cover it up. So I think it's important that we take a listen and learn more about this particular tribe and see how it's connected to what we see in our society today. And he'll reference this in the clip that we're about to listen to.
When I was a kid, I often wondered where the vernacular for the racial categorization in the United States came from. I mean, are white people really white, or are they more of a pinkish tan? Obviously, Asians don't have yellow skin, and Native Americans aren't really red, and black people aren't really the color black. However, one of my favorite groups on Earth to learn about that gets almost no attention in the Western world are the Nilotes of sub-Saharan Africa, who almost appear to be a caricature of African features. The Nilotes are perhaps one of the most phenotypically unique people on the entire planet, with an almost universal appearance consisting of jet black skin, quite distinct facial features, and a tall and lanky frame, and even the Nilotic homeland in East Africa has a pretty cool shape. The features of this unique racial group is a consequence of their position and environment in the continent of Africa, lying in one of the hottest, most humid overall places in the world. And although there is no central unity among the Nilotes today, divided into countless subgroups, many had attained a strong presence in not only the history of Africa, but other parts of the world as well. So what exactly are the parameters for these Nilotic peoples? Why are they so distinct and of such great interest to human anthropologists? And what is the history behind the envoys and empires from this unique group of people that have been greatly neglected in the academic world? Naturally, the name for the Nilotic people, as well as the greater Nilo-Saharan language family, is derived from the Nile River, which is of course one of the longest in the world, stretching from Egypt and snaking its way down to Lake Victoria in the middle of East Africa, with the Nilotes mostly centered around the White Nile and the fertile plains that surround it. Nilotes are the eastern half of the Nilo-Saharan peoples, which in itself is a bit of a dubious classification, as it's incredibly difficult to classify many supposed Nilo-Saharan languages similar to the Khoisan family, and hence they're grouped together mostly for convenience sake, and it's been proposed that the group as a whole may actually be related to either the Niger-Congo or Afro-Asiatic language families, although no widely accepted conclusion has been accepted, either from an anthropological or linguistic view. The Nilotic group proper is spread out over several East African countries, but especially in South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, and they are believed to have originated in the Upper Nile some 3,000 years ago, and gradually spread south over the millennia, and most Nilotes have specific genetic markers such as haplogroup A and B, which are linked to other pre-Bantu populations of sub-Saharan Africa such as the Pygmy and Khoi. The unique phenotype of the Nilotes can be attributed as a genetic adaptation to their environment, as lacking in body hair, their skin is the primary defense from UV radiation, absorbing most of the sunlight with its extremely dark color, while their tall and slender frame is an adaptation that allows their bodies to expel heat quicker in the hot, humid savanna of Africa, as most know that thermal energy is radiated quicker as surface area increases in proportion to volume. Although studies do vary, the average Nilote is around 6'2", being 6'4" for males and 6 foot for females, and records show that the Nilotes of South Sudan were actually even taller in the past than they are today, mainly because of malnutrition caused by famine and war. But even today, it's not uncommon to see men and women that dwarf over other African peoples and nearly every other group on Earth, and this lanky frame clearly gives them an edge in competitive athletic events. Among athletes from Kenya and Uganda, Nilotic peoples are extraordinarily overrepresented in sports and other athletic events, with over 75% of Kenyan and Ugandan athletes at the Olympics belonging to this racial group. And this is also true for countries in which Nilotes make up a smaller share of the population, such as in Ethiopia and Tanzania. Southern Nilotes from Kenya and Uganda generally have less pronounced features than their northern counterparts. For example, they might not have the same telltale jet black skin and are on average ever so slightly shorter by a couple inches while still being incredibly tall, and this is most likely due to admixture from Bantus and Horn Africans. The Maasai, being the southernmost group, are still easily categorized into the Nilotic group, yet also have considerable admixture from Bantus and especially ancient Cushitic migrants, which can be seen in their unique facial features somewhat reminiscent of Somalis and Ethiopians. Because the Nilo-Saharan language family is quite poorly attested, it is difficult to ascertain which peoples in this group are part of the Nilotic family proper, and the Nubian language is considered to be closely related to the Nilotic end of the spectrum, only lying further north along the Nile, and is actually presently completely isolated from any other Nilo-Saharan group. The Nubians were well known in the ancient world in both the east and the west, establishing the kingdom of Kush in the 8th century BC, and the Nubian language is actually the oldest known recorded language of sub-Saharan Africa. Kush was a monarchy that lasted nearly 1,000 years and even briefly invaded and conquered the Egyptians in the 7th century BC until being expelled by the Assyrians. The Nubians were also one of the few African peoples that converted to Orthodox Christianity, having done so in the 6th century AD, and this led to the formation of the Kingdom of Makuria, a Christian Nubian kingdom that was able to repel the Islamic invasions from the north, which had already conquered all of Egypt and the Maghreb. Makuria stretched as far north as Luxor and Aswan at its height, although gradually lost.
We're going to pause right here because it's time to make some announcements. If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we're unpacking the history of African tribes prior to the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And, you know, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was listening to these clips and watching these videos is how cool would be some of these companies that are into collecting your DNA, so you can decide, you can discover where which tribe or the possibility of which area you originated from. I sometimes, I think how cool would it be for them to engage with youth in the schools at a very young age, first grade even, and testing their DNA so they can start learning more about their history that preceded the transatlantic slave trade, because that's what they're typically taught in schools, unless they have a very insightful teacher that's sharing additional information with them, or they're in a household that is sharing additional information and making sure they're reading other books than what they're being taught in schools. And I think that's really important to get into what we're going to be talking about when we come back from break. We're going to finish up listening to this particular video. And again, I'm going to try to post the actual videos as part of the links when I upload the recording from the show, because I think when you start seeing the features, it will resonate, especially for African Americans in this country, where you'll see some similarities into your own ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and it may take a different look then in looking at some of the photos that we're taking and really making that connection of, this now is making more sense. And that's what the One Human Nation show is all about, is really trying to get to the point where we can reconcile our history so that we can heal. So let's make some announcements here, and we'll be back with the One Human Nation show.
Support for this portion of WRUU-LP programming comes from listeners and Savannah Stopover, presenting An Evening with Velvet Caravan live in concert on Friday, September 14th at the Lucas Theater with jazz singer Annie Selick and the Atlanta Balkan Brass Band Mercury Orchestra. For more information and tickets, go to savannahboxoffice.com.
The Humane Society of Greater Savannah's mission is to better the lives of pets and people. They provide pet adoptions, a low-cost spay and neuter clinic, a surrender prevention program, dog training classes, pet rehoming, and the Pets for Patriots Partnership, among other services. For more information, visit humanesocietysav.org.
WRUU brings you the most diverse and passionate local radio programming on the air in Savannah. This all-volunteer and nonprofit community radio station accepts no money from any form of government. Our diversity and independence is made possible only through the generous financial support of listeners like you. We rely on your annual and ongoing monthly contributions to cover the many costs associated with bringing you our broadcast and web programming. If you are a contributor, thank you. If you're not yet a contributor, please show your appreciation of the role WRUU plays in your life by becoming a contributor in any amount. You can donate quickly and easily by credit card or check. Just find the donate and subscribe links at WRUU.org. Thanks for listening to and supporting WRUU.
This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and I'm looking at time, so I'm going to try to get in the rest of this clip about the Nilotes, but there are some other things I want to get into, especially the role of how religion played into the stories that were told to enslaved people. In researching some of the history in my Gullah Geechee community, there was definitely an impact from Islam. There were enslaved people that still read the Quran, but they had to sneak away and do that. And some of that is reflected in some of the names. But anyway, I don't have time to go through all of that, but let's continue listening to some information about the Nilotes tribe in the continent of Africa.
Lost territory to the Islamic armies before eventually being completely absorbed by the Mamluks of Egypt, followed by the Ottoman Turks in the 1400s. Following this conquest, virtually the entirety of the surviving Nubian community was either willingly or forcibly converted to the Islamic faith, and this left Ethiopia as the last great Christian power in the continent of Africa at the time. Although the Nubians are still around today in Egypt and Sudan, they are heavily mixed with the surrounding Arabs, and most speak Arabic as a second language. Although the Hutu and Tutsi of Rwanda and Burundi are both considered Bantu groups by most anthropologists today and speak dialects of the same Rwanda-Rundi language, these two groups are ethnically distinct from each other, and although they have been separated for hundreds of years, there has been intermarriage between the two for many generations. When the Germans and Belgians first stumbled upon this region of East Africa in the 18th century, they recognized the Tutsis as ethnically and phenotypically distinct, as the Tutsi are considerably taller than the Hutu on average and have more of what the Belgians called Caucasian features, and seeing how they were already a dominant minority in the regions, the Belgians placed them in charge of the new colony. Interestingly, the Tutsi do have a slightly different genetic makeup than their Hutu counterparts, which owes to admixture from other sub-Saharan racial groups, and the slight difference in appearance and the historical dominance of the Tutsis is what led to the tragic genocides in the late 20th century. Although historians vary on the subject, a good chunk of the ancestors of the Tutsi arrived in Rwanda sometime in the past 500 to 1,000 years from the north, and it's been shown through genetic studies that the Tutsi do have considerable admixture from both the Nilotes, which would explain the great height differentials, and the Cushites, which would explain the Horn African facial features, although although there is considerable overlap with the neighboring Hutu people, and over time the Tutsis dropped their original Nilo-Saharan or Afro-Asiatic language, but were still culturally and politically dominant in the region, even establishing their own kingdom as early as the 15th century, despite never making up more than 15% of the population. Therefore, it can be concluded that groups like the Maasai and the Tutsi are somewhat hybrid populations in the region of East Africa, and these groups even have legends about how their ancestors came from the north hundreds of years ago in order to conquer in the case of the Tutsis, and in order to settle in the case of the Maasai. Historically, many Nilo-Saharan peoples were assimilated into Afro-Asiatic groups, especially the advancing Arabs from the north, which is why the vast majority of the Sudanese Arab population has some degree of Nilo-Saharan admixture, either from Nubian, Fur, or Nilotic extraction, as well as heavy admixture from the neighboring Horn African peoples, and this is also true for Arabs in southern Egypt to a lesser degree. Due to these racial and linguistic differences, the Nilo-Saharan peoples of Sudan found themselves to be the victims of harsh discrimination by the Sudanese government in the 20th century, which of course led to the formation of the world's newest internationally recognized country, South Sudan. Other than race and language, one of the primary factors in the split in Sudan was due to the religious and cultural differences, as Sudanese Arabs are overwhelmingly practitioners of Sunni Islam, while Islam never really took hold in the Nilotic inhabitants of the south. Up until very recently, the Nilotic peoples of Sudan still held on to various animistic beliefs, being one of the last regions of Africa yet to be Christianized. However, in the past 2 to 3 decades, there has been an explosion of Christianity among these peoples, jumping from 15% to over 70% in only a generation, and this was one of the main catalysts for the independence of South Sudan, along with severe discrimination towards the Nilotes by the Sudanese government. By compiling many sources on the matter, we are actually able to come to the conclusion that currently over 80% of the Nilotic population of all countries are adherents of Christianity, split between Protestants and Catholics at a ratio of about 2 to 1, while a small minority, around 3%, practices Islam, 14% still hold on to traditional animistic religions, and only a very small minority are irreligious, although the percentage of Nilotes that actively blend Christianity and indigenous beliefs is likely far higher than is implied. The area with the largest Nilotic population are the 3 countries of Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan, all at over 10 million each, although smaller numbers still exist in the peripheries of Sudan and Ethiopia, and drooping down into Tanzania. Large numbers of refugees fleeing the war-torn South Sudan are also present in other African countries, as well as a community nearly 150,000 strong in North America, and far smaller numbers in Europe and Australia, adding up to 45 million people, although Sudan is currently the only Nilotic majority country. Even so, it still amazes me that the Nilotic people are not given sufficient attention in other parts of the world, considering their extremely unique history, physiology, and genetics, which has influenced and been influenced by many other groups around them. So next time you watch the Olympics or any marathon from almost any country in the world, pay attention to where the competitors are from. Chances are you will recognize this people group almost immediately. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts on the Nilotes and other related peoples such as the Nubians.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. And like I've mentioned before, we're delving into the topic of why there is such an identity name crisis for blacks in this country that are the descendants of slaves. And I think it leads to a lot of the disconnect that we see in our youth. Now, there's another video we're going to listen to, and I know based on what I'm looking at on time, we're not going to be able to listen to the entire clip. And again, I will post a link to the entire YouTube video when I upload the recording for this show. But so let's see how much we can get into it. And this is based on someone that really has delved into looking at biblical scholars, and they're going to be quoting some scriptures. And so for those of you that are not quote unquote religious, expand your mind and just look on it as historical information. For others of you that do consider yourself to be Christians, this may resonate in a different way. the whole point is to be open to listening to different points of view. So let's take a listen here.
Black history. According to the public school system, Negroes were brought to America in 1619, forced to work as slaves on plantations, until one day this great white man named Abraham Lincoln came along and felt bad for the slaves and signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which freed the slaves. But there were still some bad whiteys in the southern states that passed Jim Crow laws for segregation. Afterwards, there came more whites that felt bad and then gave blacks civil rights in the 1960s, then allowed a black man to have the presidential office named Barack Obama. Now blacks are finally equal to whites. We can all get along. The end. Now, moving right along to our English lecture for the day. I don't think so. Black history. What do you know about black history? Let me ask you a question. Prior to the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the 1600s, what was your nationality? What did you call yourself? Some may say African. Well, Africa is a continent, and in that continent, there's over 47 different countries in there. Which one do you come from? What language did you speak prior to the 1600s? Was it English? There's over 1,500 dialects being spoken in the land of Africa. Pick one. What clothing did you wear? Was it high heels and stilettos? Skinny jeans and Vans? What food did you eat? Hamburgers and hot dogs? French fries and SpaghettiOs? What religion did you partake in? Who was your God? Was it Christianity and Cesare Borgia? Most of you have no idea about the answer to these questions. You have no recollection of any history prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, is that a coincidence or by random chance? I don't think so. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it that in the public school system that every time the subject of black history is taught, it always begins in the 1600s and with slavery? Why is that? Doesn't that raise some antennas and spark inquiry? Why is it that the public school system is so committed to revolving black history solely on the past 400 years? Why is that? Is it because there's a deficiency in historical data? Or maybe because there's no history at all prior to the 1600s? Maybe black people just poofed out of thin air, sporadically, landed on slave ships, and they said, hey, we got a new species here, and start importing and exporting them all over the world. Maybe that's what happened. The question arises, what is the drawback on this history? Why does it keep being withheld? What's the big idea about it? Why is it being held hostage? That's the question.
So I'm going to forward this along because this clip is a long one, and we really only have about 5 minutes left in today's show. So if it sounds a little choppy, it's because I'm forwarding on this clip. And again, I'll be posting it when I upload the recording for this show. So let me see if I can get this further along here.
Hence me. Swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. Because ye have taken my silver and my gold, and carried into your temples my goodly pleasant things. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians. The Africans got together with the so-called Grecians or the Europeans, and they commenced in selling the Israelites that were dwelling on the west coast of Africa in slavery. There's your slave trade right there in the Bible. Both buyers, Europeans, and sellers, Africans, saw the people traded into captivity on the African coast as outsiders. Now, why did those Africans see you as outsiders? Because you were some people that migrated and encroached on their land. They knew you were not the same exact people. The customs that you had, the way you moved, they knew you were not the same people, so they had no problem commencing in a slave trade with the Europeans. Do you be crazy to believe that Africans were selling their own people? That makes no sense at all. When the Europeans put that in the textbooks, they're using technicalities, saying Africans sold other Africans. When they're using technicalities, what they mean to say is native Africans were selling Israelites that were living in Africa. It'd be no different if somebody wrote history 500 years from now and say there was a slave trade that happened here in America. Say black people got together and start selling white people to the Chinese. If somebody with the same mindset that the Europeans have wrote history 500 years from now, they would say Americans were selling other Americans to the Chinese. When it's two totally different nation of people living in America. You can't just say Americans sold other Americans. Two totally different people. It's the same exact scenario on the west coast of Africa. There are both oral and written explanations that trace the origin of the Igbo. And the most tantalizing is an association of the Igbo to the Hebrew race. This assumption is based on the fact that Igbo culture has many similar traditional customs like that of the Jews. Similar customs are observed in marriage negotiations, childbirth and circumcision, restitution, attitude to totem animals and taboos, as well as hospitality to others, especially to strangers, etc. The Igbo are therefore said to be the split and lost group or tribe of Israel that refused to wander further northeast with Moses, but preferred going down southward. The Igbo people have many Jewish traditions. Naomi Katz, the current Israeli ambassador in Nigeria, and others point to their possible ancient Israelite origins. See, the scholars, they've done their research on the Igbo tribe, extensive research. And they've compared the traditions of the Igbo tribe, and they've matched them up to the biblical traditions of the Israelites. And they said, whoa, these are strikingly similar. The only way that these people could be practicing the Hebraic faith this close is if they were the biblical Israelites themselves. So you may ask yourself, what is the significance of the Igbo tribe to the so-called Negro in the Americas? When you do the research, what you're going to find out is that the Igbo tribe is one of the main sought-out tribes that were captured and sold in the Transatlantic Slave Trade and came right here to America. The British were the major buyers before.
I'm sorry, folks. We're kind of out of time for today's show. But again, I will be posting these links when I upload the recording. And as we close out today's show, keep in mind that if you want to connect with me and you want to share your story about race and racism and where you are in your reconciliation journey, send me an email at mystory@onehumannation.info. If there's a particular topic that you would like us to cover in more detail, send an email to onehumannation@gmail.com. Keep in mind there's also a podcast that you can subscribe to so that every time I upload a recording, you will get notification and you can listen to podcasts and previous podcasts so you can continue your journey into reconciliation and healing. And I also have a YouTube station, and all that will be posted when I upload the recordings. So as we finish out today's show, coming up next is Troy Stoner with Sound Limits. And thank you for listening. And I hope this show has been insightful for you to gain more insight into what it's going to take for us to become one human nation, and taking a look at what needs to happen for reconciliation and healing in this country. And I do believe it needs to start with the truth of our history prior to the transatlantic slave trade. So as we close out today, we're going to listen to the interlude music provided by Joe Morales as we get ready for Sound Limits. Here we go.